Lipids. What are lipids? Lipids are united in that they are hydrophobic or water-fearing. They do not mix with water. So this includes fats and oils and a couple of other things. But these molecules do not form true polymers. So with carbohydrates, things like glycogen or starch or cellulose, those chains can be very, very, very long. Thousands, millions, billions of glucose molecules or other simple carbohydrates that are added to a chain. Lipids don't do that. They don't act in the same way. So they're not considered to be true polymers because you just can't add millions and millions of subunits to them. But the one thing that they do all tend to have in common is that they don't really mix with water very well. And even though there's so much water in a cell, in our bodies are mostly water, we do also have these hydrophobic substances that are very useful, essential for life. Why are they hydrophobic? Because they are not, carbohydrate means water, carbon and water. CH2O is carbohydrate. Hydrocarbons are just carbon and hydrogen. And hydrocarbons, you might remember, are nonpolar. The bonds are nonpolar because hydrogen and carbon share their electrons pretty well with each other. Neither of them is like tugging on them so that you don't get these partial positive and negative charges on them. And that's why they don't interact with water, because water is polar, has those polar covalent bonds, so it likes to interact with charged things. So I'm going to tell you about three main types of lipids, which are fats, phospholipids, and steroids. How are lipids important to living organisms? Like I said, three main types of lipids that we find in every body, every type of organism: fats, phospholipids, and steroids. They all have different functions. So fats are made up of two types of smaller molecules. You have a 3-carbon molecule called glycerol, and then you've got these things called fatty acids. So fatty acids are so called because they have a carboxyl group on them. And you may remember that a carboxyl group is the organic acid functional group. C double bonded to oxygen and single bonded to OH. So that's what makes them acids, is that they have that functional group. And then the fatty part of them has to do with the long hydrocarbon chain or hydrocarbon tail. So I'll show you a picture of that in a minute or a second. About a second. Here we go. Boom. What? Oh, here's water shunning a fatty acid. Oh, we just can't be together. Is it because I'm fat? Bad old water body shaming the fat. Okay, so here's how we make a fat. Another word for a fat is a triglyceride or a triacyl glycerol. Both of those kind of a mouthful. But what you should get out of this is that there are three of these fatty acids that are attached to that glycerol. So glycerol has three of these hydroxyl groups on there. Hopefully you recognize that functional group. We can pull off a molecule of water, a dehydration synthesis, and add this long hydrocarbon chain with the acid group here to that glycerol molecule. And that's how we make a fat. We have three of them, three of these big long chains of carbon and hydrogen attached to that glycerol molecule. And it's not always, and the fatty acids are highly variable. There are a lot of fatty acids out there, a lot of ways that you can have different length chains of carbon and hydrogen in a fatty acid. But then there's also something else that I need to tell you about. Before we get to that, you should understand that fats are hydrophobic because those water molecules don't hydrogen bond to fats because they're not polar. The fats aren't polar. But usually what you have is the molecules that don't attach to water, don't hydrogen bond with water, are going to form into particles. Like, and you know this if you've ever had if you ever cooked bacon or something fatty and then you add water to the pan to wash it, what happens to all that fatty, greasy stuff? It forms little bubbles at the top, or little like circles. And that's because all the fats are sticking together because they're nonpolar, and the water is not able to stick to them because water is polar. So the fatty acids in a fat, they can all be the same, or there can be two different kinds, or there can be all three different kinds. So you can see here again, here's your fat molecule with its three fatty acids, these things in this sort of buttery color, attached to that glycerol, which is in this gray color. And rather than sit here and spend our time counting all these, you can see that this middle one here is a little bit shorter than the other two. So the fatty acids don't all have to be the same. We don't all make the same kinds of fat. So what's the difference between saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids? Has to do with if you have double bonds in your fatty acid or not. Remember, carbon can form double bonds because it can share more than one pair of electrons with another atom. And often it'll share more than one pair of electrons with another carbon atom. So if a fatty acid is saturated, that means it can hold no more hydrogen atoms. And that means it has no double bonds. We can saturate a fatty acid that has double bonds in it, but only if it is an unsaturated fatty acid. An unsaturated fatty acid has at least one double bond, sometimes more than one double bond. And that has a lot to do with what that fat, how that fat behaves at room temperature. So saturated fats, which have no double bonds, are often found in things like butter and cream and animal fats. Lard, for example, tends to have a lot of saturated fat in it. And at room temperature, saturated fats tend to be solid, or they have a very low freezing point. They go from liquid to solid at a fairly high temperature. Unsaturated fats are typically found in the form of oils, plant oils. Plant oils like olive oil here. And the reason for that is that they've got unsaturated fats. They've got double bonds. And the double bond, if it's in cis, is going to cause bending of this fatty acid molecule. And that bending means that the molecules are harder to compress together. And just like you saw with water freezing, if you can't compact the molecules together, they're not as dense. Only in this case, what that means is olive oil is liquid at room temperature, and it doesn't solidify unless you put it in the fridge, and then it gets kind of weird and gross. So don't put your olive oil in the fridge. So fats made from saturated fatty acids are saturated fats. They tend to be solid at room temperature. That's something we see typically in animals, especially warm-blooded animals. Fats from unsaturated fatty acids, unsaturated fats, liquid at room temperature, think olive oil, canola oil, palm oil, peanut oil, and plant fats and fish fats. Both of these are usually unsaturated. And we just saw kind of an example of why do we see such distantly related organisms having the same kind of chemicals in them, with fungi and arthropods and chitin. In this case, there's a fairly simple explanation for why fish and plants have unsaturated fatty acids. And it has to do with the function of fatty acids in cells. A lot of the time, those fatty acids are going to be part of phospholipids, which I think are the next thing I talk about. I'll get to that. But has to do with the temperature that the organism lives at and the functionality of the fat. Okay, so cattle, chickens, pigs, pork are all warm-blooded animals, so they tend to have more saturated fats in them. Plants and fish don't regulate their temperature as well, so they have to have fatty acids that are able to contend with cooler temperatures, be liquid at cooler temperatures, because you really need those fats to be liquid to function, is kind of the short version of that story. So it is said that if you eat a lot of saturated fat, that can contribute to heart disease, because the saturated fats can form plaques in our arteries, and eventually our arteries can become occluded or blocked up, and that's when you have problems like a heart attack or a stroke. Hydrogenation. Who's ever read the label on something like a Twinkie or a snack cake and seen that one of the ingredients is partially hydrogenated plant oil? And what's happening there is you're converting an unsaturated fat to a saturated fat by breaking those double bonds and adding hydrogen. One of the problems with that is that when we artificially hydrogenate vegetable oils, we create unsaturated fats that are not cis trans fats, but are trans. Did I just say cis trans fats? I did. Not cis unsaturated, they are trans unsaturated. And in the past few years, it's been discovered that trans fats, ones that have double bonds that are in trans rather than in cis. Remember cis-trans isomers from the carbon talk. Trans fats may be more guilty of contributing to heart disease than saturated fats. Let's see if I have a picture. Yeah, okay. So trans fats, typically produced artificially. They can also be produced by frying. When they're in cis, you have this bending in the molecule. They get kinked, and that makes them harder to, they don't solidify at room temperature as much. Whereas if they're in trans, it kind of, what it does is it kind of makes that linear chain more rigid, more straight. So it's going to be solid at room temperature. And in plaque formation, it's thought that these molecules can oppress or join into plaques a lot more easily than, say, these what we call good fats, these cis unsaturated fatty acids like we find in olive oil. And that these trans fats are an even bigger contributor to heart disease than saturated fatty acids. A lot of research in this area, of course, because we have a very fat-rich diet. We'd like to know which fats are likely to kill us more quickly. You may have heard that omega-3 fatty acids are good fats. Our bodies don't produce them. We have to eat them in our diet. And where do we get omega-3 fatty acids? We get them from certain types of vegetable oils like flaxseed oil and olive oil. We get them from eating cold water fish, like salmon, for example, is rich in omega-3 fatty acids. And that word omega-3 comes to us from from where the double bonds are. So here is the methyl end, or the tail of that hydrocarbon chain. Here's the acid group, and usually we would call this the alpha carbon, the first carbon that's in that acid group, and then we'd be like alpha, beta, gamma, delta, blah, 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 blah. And then the last letter in the Greek alphabet is omega. I am the alpha and the omega. So here's the omega at the end of the tail. If we go back 3 carbons, 1, 2, 3, there's a double bond. So that's what makes it an omega-3 fatty acid, is that you're 3 from the tail end of the carbon chain. So omega-3 fatty acids are supposed to be good for you, better for you than saturated fatty acids or trans fats. Avocados are rich in MUFAs, which are monounsaturated fatty acids. So unsaturated fatty acids with one double bond in them.